Zullen we beginnen met... Ja, we zijn inmiddels wel een kwartier na de wind. Ja, dat vinger zelfs.
Scherm daar zo.
Dan ga ik er zelf voor in.
En dat voorste rij ook. Je bent er heel snel aan. Ja, het begin is heel wat. Ja? Goed. Welkom allemaal. We zijn blij dat jullie er zijn. We hebben vandaag 2 talks. De eerste talk is van Antje. Die gaat iets vertellen over user interface tekst en dan specifiek hoe werkt het proces nou rondom de copy die in Drupal core zit. Zeg ik het zo goed?
Ja, of hoe is er geen proces?
Hoe is er geen proces en hoe kunnen we dat veranderen misschien wel? Dus dat. En daarna hebben we nog een talk van, als ik het goed zeg, Niels Leenheer. Over Bluetooth en JavaScript. Ik had in eerste instantie Bluetooth en JavaScript. Bestaat daar een API voor? Het antwoord is ja. En Niels gaat ons er alles over vertellen. Maar eerst geef ik graag het woord aan Boris namens Leenheer, waar we te gast zijn vandaag.
Hier sta ik ook in de camera. Ja, welkom bij Leenheer Groen. Het is al een tijdje geleden dat we de Tech Talk hebben gehost. Als ik het goed heb is het december 2014 geweest, begin december. In ons vorige kantoor nog, aan de Westeloksdijk. Inmiddels zijn we hier nu 1,5 jaar geleden ingekomen. Toen we met z'n 9 waren, inmiddels zijn we wat gegroeid, nu zijn we met 16 mensen. We zijn blij dat we dit een keer mochten doen. De Tech Talk is initieel opgestart door Hoppinger en Triquanta. En toen Triquanta een aantal maanden geleden spijtig failliet ging, hebben we samen met Hoppinger de bal opgepakt en ervoor gezorgd dat de Tech Talk kon blijven bestaan. Dus vanaf nu, of eigenlijk vanaf de vorige Tech Talk, doen Leenheer Groen en Hoppinger de organisatie van de Tech Talk. En zo hopen we leuke sprekers te kunnen vinden, interessante sessies. Ik ben blij dat jullie er zijn. Dit is ons mooie kantoortje waar ik heel trots op ben. Veel plezier vanavond.
Ja, dankjewel.
Ja, ook leuk dat jullie er allemaal zijn. Nice that you're here. I'm going to do this talk in English because it's a talk that is intended for the Dev Days in 2 weeks. And I was asked on short notice whether I could also do it here, which I think is a really great opportunity actually to be able to try out your talk before you actually do it. It has the slight problem that there's some things that I want to work on at first days of Dev Days that still need to go into the talk. So there might be some gaps, but I'll point that out. I'm going. You should be supposed to be seeing my speaker's notes.
Screen is mirrored. Sorry.
Screen is mirrored. I can also do it without. I mean, you can also see my speaker's notes. In fact, if anybody would like to see the notes while I'm talking, they are on gitlab.io, which means you can also see the speaker's notes anyway. Thanks. So I'm Antje Lorch, Ifrik on Twitter and on the issue queue. And as I said, my slides are at ifrik.gitlab.io/Drupal UI text. I'm a site builder. I'm building Drupal websites mainly for small organizations, preferably working very close together with the people that actually going to be using the site. It means closely working with the people who are actually going to see Drupal, how it looks from very early on. But I'm also by training, I'm a biologist and I worked as an editor for a scientific journal for several years. So I have also a certain affinity with text and with the changes it makes if you change text. But just to get a short idea who you are, so who's developing modules? Who's building sites? Who's mainly theming?
Yeah.
Who's only here because you're going to have a beer with nice people afterwards? Let's start by the question, what are user interface texts? And in defying English grammar, I would still prefer to actually talk as texts in plural, because there's bits of text all over site that are actually separate entities, and it's not that we talk about the user interface as a whole, or the user interface text as a whole. So when it comes to developers, actually, quite often, it's only very little of the code and the words that are written that are actually user interface text. Like this a bit from the Fields UI module, where just the words save and manage fields, or manage fields as a title or as a value for an action, is actually user interface text. The rest is all the actual code and the comments in the code. So on a whole, actually, for developers writing modules, writing code, user interface text just seems to be a very small portion of the actual text that we're writing. And in many cases, the functionality of the code and writing tests to make sure that the code works seems to be much more important quite often as something that can also be tested. But there's a bit of text that actually the users see that comes from the developers, like phrases like login or register to post comments, or the special characters that are allowed for making a username. That's kind of user interface text that directly comes from Drupal core. There isn't that much text on a website that the actual user, the visitor of a website or a project later sees that actually comes out of core, but there are those bits. For site developers, however, that's completely different. You have lots of text that is like navigation or actions, goes from page titles to buttons to text everywhere. I'm going to go into more detail later. But basically, for a user that installs a default Drupal site, that adds up to 200 pages that are full of text. That's just Drupal default installation. That's no extra modules for multilingual or media or any contrib modules. That's already 200 pages full of text. So those little bits of text that you write in your module actually add up to an enormous amount of text, user interface text. So yeah, as in case anybody was wondering about my tweet earlier today, 200 pages is what you get out of the box. And of course the usual project will have way more. So to me, UI texts are actually the words that a developer are speaking to the users. It might look like it's a text you put on a website and somebody else is reading, but in fact it's also the developer saying something about what is this doing, how is this called, what it's supposed to do. And it's therefore talking to the users. So therefore I was quite happy about your tweet about saying this is about talking to machines. I think it's actually about developers talking to users through the machine. So having 200 pages, having so much interaction that is mainly words with a few lines and a bit of color, but mainly words, we can actually say UI texts are important. As simple as that. And if they're important, we have UI text standards, except for we don't. If we had, I could just finish this talk here. But unfortunately, Drupal does not have UI text standards. Just let that sink in slowly. There's a content style guide that talks about maybe using American English and not British English, how modules should be written with a capital and things like that. But that is, if you look at the URL, that is actually the style guide for Drupal.org. It is applied quite often to the software in Drupal as well, but this is actually Drupal.org style guide. Which is kind of funny because Drupal.org of course uses Drupal, but the styles are very general. They're more about tone of voice. Sometimes, yeah, it has stuff like whether you use the word upgrade or update, which is a useful thing, but in general it's more about how you write it nicely to one type of audience. Sometimes we actually have some things like this, and I'll let you guess where it comes from. All summaries must be less than 80 characters, start with a capital letter and end with a period. They must provide a brief description of what the element does. Anybody know what that applies to?
Function field summary.
Comments in the code. This is the Drupal coding standard for the first line in the dot block, which says it should start with a capital, it should end with a dot. So yes, that's in the coding standards. That's where we talk about how long a line should be, how it should finish, what it should do. And if you, it's actually a very long text. I mean, it's a very long page that has, I think, about 8 different points just for code, comments in code. That's the stuff that the other developers see. That's not something that anybody sees who's going to be using a Drupal to build a website or use a project later. And if you don't do that, you actually get a comment like this in a review like this, that your line of comment in the code is missing a full stop at the end. And when you get that as a kind of nitpick one, you should just do it. That's fine. Okay, well, that's a standard. I do that. Okay. When you look at the software, you think, oh, actually, that's kind of a useful thing. It should be like starting with a capital, finishing with a dot, not too long. So you think this might have actually been applied to the extend page, the page with all the modules and the module descriptions, except for it isn't. You actually also end up with descriptions that go over like 2 lines, or in case of Solar Search defaults, tells you how to uninstall the module, or the workflows description is actually what's causing the extend page to have a scroll bar onto the site, in case anybody ever wonders about that. That comes because the module description is something like 160 characters long, quite long. So taking the experience from our coding standard and taking the experience of where do you actually see these texts, it would actually be quite easy to make 2 simple rules for the module description, to say all module descriptions must be less than 80 characters, start with a verb and a capital letter, end with a full stop, and together with the module name, they must form a sentence that describes what the module does or what it allows the user to do. That could be a simple UI text standard. That would be 2 lines, not 8, by the way. So actually quite short, quite concise. That's something we could apply. And that's also possible because in the case of a module description, we actually know who the users are that are going to be seeing this. It's going to be mainly the site builders, either after they've already decided on the module and just want to know which sort of the different submodules they're going to be needing, or in case you have like Drupal core and you want to install any additional modules, or you're on a shared kind of hosting where distribution where some modules are provided. And the other people that probably see this text as the kind of developers, the technical support, people that take over a website from somebody else and do a composer show to see which modules actually are there and might updating. So that's a kind of defined user group in a defined situation. So therefore we can actually quite easy make a standard like that. I'm just giving you that as an example to see what I mean when I say we should have standards. We don't need to have a long page that tells you what kind of voice. That's also useful, but we could have actually standards there. But the question is also really like, who do you actually talk to when you put UI text on the site? When you put a UI text like manage fields as a value for an action, or a short description in the help text for a certain page. And that's quite different users we're talking to. It's other developers that might read your comments in the code, but also might read the actual interface once they have to install a module to see how that works together. It's site builders. It's themers that, for example, need to make image styles and date formats. It's technical support stuff, people that kind of take over a site, that make sure it doesn't break. It's the content creators, the people that actually put stuff into the existing site, and of course it's the visitors of the site. And they all look at UI texts. They look at UI text at specific places, in specific context. Luckily, they're not all looking at the same text at the same time with different purposes. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of UI text that we have and who I think the users are. This is the point where I've been planning on the first day of Dev Days to actually sit down and make that kind of inventory. So there's probably some things missing, but it's just to give you an idea on where do you have different users with different needs. So there's a help on the actual finished website or the finished project. It's stuff like add new comment, which is, by the way, hard-coded. Even if you have different comment types, it always says add new comment. There's an issue for that. But also, when you want to upload an image, out of the box, or you always have this one file or multiple files, the file size, and the allowed types. Again, this is hard-coded in core. Any site builder who had come across this thing of being asked to put that in one line, know the pain of agony that you actually have to do to then actually kind of change the admin theme to make this happen. So which is, I think, those texts we really need to pay actually a lot of attention to, because these are the texts that thousands of people are seeing. Every single site that has a comment function starts out with the add new comment line. And actually, I think if we ever want to do A/B testing for UI text, I think that would be good candidates to actually see how people use the site differently depending on what we can do with these texts. There's lots of navigation elements. Lots of the words we use on the site are page titles, menu items, tab titles. They kind of give an indication of what you have on the site, but also where you need to go. And one thing that's really bugging me is that we have actually no guidance on how to deal with the match between the page title and the tab title. The permissions one, does anybody know from the top of your head what that will give you?
The list of users.
Mm-hmm. But when you look at it and you're not an experienced Drupal user, you will think permissions, and it has a button to say or list. But to me that sounds like listing or permissions. In other cases we have the page title is always the same as the tab title. Sometimes it gives the kind of context. That's something where we really should look into it and see. Tab titles are kind of navigation with a context, but we're not really using that. So if we could kind of clarify that a bit and get rid of the fact that we have sometimes 30 pages that they all say manage display, and you never know where you are because you have to look in the breadcrumb. That's a UI text where I think we can actually improve quite a lot. And that's actually also something that a lot of different types of users are using. The site builders and themers that are still building the site administrators that, for example, need to find a page where you create new users or where you ban users or those kind of things. Content creators, but also evaluators. People that want to know what Drupal does. They're also running into these pages where sometimes it might not be quite sure what's behind that, like what's behind display modes, for example. Then we have all the kind of buttons that are used for performing tasks or not performing tasks. There we have a kind of general understanding how they work, like the primary action is blue, the cancel action is usually gray, the destructive action is not actually a button but displayed as a link and in red, except from if anybody has been following this issue. If you cancel a user account, you have a button that says cancel account and cancel. Because canceling a user account are two different actions that you could take, either disabling it or deleting it. So 10 years ago, somebody had a good idea to deal with that by calling it cancel account. Yeah, but now we have these two buttons that seem to have the same words. So there are some points where we are kind of locked into the situation that we have chosen words that seem to be a bit problematic. we need to look at the bigger picture. There's also all the buttons for actions or the drop-down menus for drop-down lists for different actions. The remove one, for example, that's from the block layout page. Until 8.4, that said delete, which was a bit confusing because you're only deleting the instance of a block, but not the block itself. Except from there are actually two different types of blocks, but we changed that to say remove, so that the user doesn't think, oh my god, I won't be able to log into the site anymore because I've deleted the login block. So that's kind of small changes. We're also, that's UI text. That's one of these little bits that are somewhere in your code. And we need to find a way of dealing with them. Again, that's are the kind of buttons, the kind of links, actions that a lot of users are using. And that are usually out of the reach of the site builder. So that in order to change that, you either have to override it in a translation or put it in settings PHP or make a patch on core for your local site. Not the kind of things you actually want to do. So I should really see whether we can, where improvement is needed. And the cancel account button, that's RTBC. So hopefully that will be gone in 8.6. Then we have help pages. That can actually be helpful. And hopefully you ever only need to see them once. If you have a new module, it should actually give you lots of information, but also all the links to the relevant pages where you can do something. And then we have the help on the admin pages. And that's where things tend to go a bit wrong at times, because there's no clear understanding what they're for. Again, this is a managed display for content types, so it gives you actually quite a lot of information, including what a teaser typically is or so. What it doesn't tell you is where you can actually make new display modes. And for my understanding, the text is actually too long. But we don't have clear understanding what the purpose of these texts is. To me, well, they're mainly used by site builders, again, themers, also administrators. For example, if they need to go and ban an IP address, which you don't do so often, but once in a while you might need to do that, and you've probably forgotten how this works. Or you have a module that you haven't used for a year. So to me, that's the kind of thing that should give you some context, some information, also the link that you've been looking for, the words you might need to Google. And then we also have more specific explanations. For example, this is about the widget in your display form settings. Again, they're just written by whoever is working on the module. And I think we can actually also get, especially copywriters, people that know about technical writing, documentation, to approve quite a lot of this text. Because to me, that text is too long. Especially because it also repeats itself over and over again in your form. So it's also starting to clutter up the form to the point that you're just not going to read any of this anymore. So again, I think there's some space where some A/B testing on usability would also be useful for these kind of texts. So that's some overview over all the texts that I've found so far. Again, I'm looking forward to actually refining that a bit more to see what other types we have, what other purposes of UI text we have. And if anybody comes across something, just give me a shout and I'm happy to add that. I think my main point is that to say we have different UI texts in the software. They have different purposes and different audiences. We don't need to write a UI text for the whole software just for one main user group. We need to actually see who's reading what and how we can reach them. And why do I want standards for that? I don't think we need standards just to kind of keep everything as it always was. We don't need to have a standard to say this. A line of code needs to be 80 characters because at some stage IBM had punch cards that had 80 characters, and we're still using that as a standard. But a standard can help us if we develop UI text standards, we can actually have this discussion about what is needed where once. We can discuss how long a description of a module should be. And if we do that once and write it down, then we don't need to start every time when there's a new module coming into core, again with the question, should this be 1 sentence or 3? Should the uninstall information be there or should it not? So it would mean we could actually have an informed discussion once instead of going on for bike shedding for ages sometimes. There's an issue to actually change this module description text that was ready, nearly ready before Drupal 8 came out. We're now stuck in a kind of time loop where we're still looking for somebody to review it because everybody who's working on these issues has by now been contributing to it. If we had standards, again, that would be easier. It also means that if somebody actually comes with a patch for a module and say, could you change this text? It would be much easier to actually RTBC it and commit it if you can point to a standard and say, this is what actually we have agreed on would be useful. And if it requires a full stop at the end, fine, I'm just going to put that there. That's much easier for everybody than going and discussing whether it should have one or maybe a semicolon or whatever. But it also, and that's for me a really important point, it allows other types of people to contribute to the Drupal development. There's lots of people who are really good in writing documentation. Usually when somebody who's a technical writer, somebody who writes documentation, when they find something that doesn't seem to work, you tend to actually start writing documentation. In your blog post, in your book, everywhere but in the core, in the software itself. If we can actually get people that know how to write into contributing to Drupal, and we don't need so many of books anymore. We don't need blog posts that tell you what this strange link actually means. And we would also provide much more consistency to users. I installed a contrib module a few weeks ago that has a list of modules in a tab that's titled add-ons. I'm not quite sure why there's a list of modules in the module, but modules are called add-ons in that one. I don't know why. It completely confused me because there's plugins and add-ons and other things, and so I don't need to be, like, I've been using Drupal for 10 years. If I'm still getting confused because somebody renamed things, then I don't know how that works for other people who are starting with Drupal, who are trying to get their way in, and we don't want to lead them into dead ends where they wonder why these are two different things or the same things. So my main point from here is actually, how do we get there? How do we get UI standards? How do we get module developers to use them? And how do we involve other users, writers, to actually contribute to this effort? Thanks.
What do you think about the fact that the English text is currently layered in the source code? Do you think that also is a factor in how accessible it is to contribute for other people?
That's not something I'd really thought of, but yes, when I started working with the documentation working group, I don't know how to program PHP, so I found it quite scary that I actually have to go into the module and start typing in there, and sometimes managing to break it because I deleted something that shouldn't have been deleted. But there's work for the whole help ecosystem. There's actually work to move the help text out of the PHP module file, because it's also a bit weird that you have all the HTML markup in the module where it shouldn't be. So I think it can be a stumbling block. I think it's become easier, and in many cases it's also sufficient if somebody could say, replace this text by this text, which is something you don't even need to actually make a patch for. You can also write up in just as a text to say this would work better.
Just for example, in Rails, just a concrete example, but in other software packages that's also true. The English text is not in the source code, but it's in a separate file, and there's in the source code just a key that points to the English text. I personally think that that's a better technical solution for text in general, but maybe that also can help in Drupal to make more.
Yeah, it's not something I thought of. I think our main point at the moment is actually get people to come up or feel that they can contribute with wording. If we can make it easier for them, and certainly with the help text, that for example is an approach to make it easier for people to look into this. How about changing the wording of a module description? That's a very short YAML file. As site builders, you're by now dealing with so many YAML files that yet another YAML file where you change a bit of wording isn't that scary. Yeah, trying to remove those hurdles can be a useful approach, yes.
And so when you talk about the help texts, and I think you had this example where you said this is way too long, and usually I agree, because there's like 5-6 lines of text, and at least I never read them, and I think many people don't. Isn't one of the problems that it's like there's this blob of text on top, but when you really want to know something, it's usually like lower down in the text when you actually see a label, view modes or something, and then you wonder, okay, what is view mode? And you have to go back and see where it was. So that got me thinking, shouldn't we have something like a glossary function in Drupal core, so which you can like enable, and any time there's view modes written somewhere, it turns into a link, or there's something like a hover where you get right there in the context the explanation what is view mode, what does it mean, and where can I create one?
That's an interesting idea. There is a glossary on Drupal.org which is seriously outdated. I always thought having a glossary would be good because it also forces developers to actually define the word they're using. So you wouldn't actually end up with somebody typing add-on means actually module, or some other words where it's sometimes not quite clear why this word has been chosen. So if that would be a way of also getting a bit more, making it more a decision to use a certain word by having to say this is what I mean with it, could already be useful. And yeah, if this kind of help text at the top, for example, or even in the widgets, could actually link to a page that would have these things, I think that could also be very useful. Because quite often when you start with Drupal as a new user or with a new module, you end up not knowing which are the relevant words are. This moment when you're like trying to find a solution, you're Googling for the wrong words, and then somebody who's been using this just says, oh no, you need to look for that word. I think a glossary might also help with those kind of problems. And yes, shortening it so that we can actually reuse explanations. Because sometimes we're actually using the same explanation at different places. And then they become out of sync. Like our different save buttons, for example, at some stage were all over the place. So if we can kind of make that more consistent, and yeah, I think a glossary would be certainly helpful. I'm not sure who's willing to take up that task.
So I think you're doing an amazing job making Drupal core better, making Drupal better for developers, for people like us. But I think there's also a huge gap, huge improvement to make, is where we site builders or we developers create, like mold Drupal for end users, for content creators, by defining content types, by defining field UIs, fields for your content types. And I see so many sites where, like, you have a news content type with, I don't know, an image field, upload an image, a body field, enter a body, like help text for the end user, which are really not helpful. wouldn't it be great if we had like a page in Drupal.org describing useful help texts for node types, which is basically like you can help so much more people other than developers.
That's also a very interesting idea. Yeah. I know in the UX meeting.
Sorry, to elaborate on this, like for example, would you use a help text to tell the editor what to enter, or should we use a help text why to enter the word? For example, say you have like a multiple term fields that are not being displayed in the output, but only used for, I don't know, Solar to match relevant content. So should I then say enter 3 to 5 words, period? Or should I say, well, ideally enter 3 to 5 words, and this is used in the backend to match relevant content? Or should I tell the editor what it is used for?
I think that we come into the realm of that Drupal is used for so many different things. But I think giving guidance to site builders of what good naming conventions are, what useful description texts are, would be a useful task as well. I mean, we have coding standards for how to name your function, but we don't have any guidance. So certainly my first projects always ended up with like field labels that were really useless afterwards when I look at them and think, why the hell did I choose that? Giving a bit of guidance on saying, how can you actually use field labels and field descriptions as something that benefits your future users? And I see two ways of doing that. One would be a page on Drupal.org that basically gives you a guidance for field UI and what the hell you can do with it and how you can make that useful. The other thing could be something like an example module that you can enable that actually gives you these different types of fields with a useful example text, for example. I think there was something, wasn't it something like that for coding examples, a module?
Well, I think that's mostly Drupal 7 days. I don't know if there's still a samples module.
Yeah.
There is, yeah.
But yeah, I think lots of the kind of good practices that we as site builders develop for ourselves or with people who work together, if you could actually share them, that would also be useful.
We should, I should create an issue in Drupal.org for adding a link to a help text or adding a field to a node type, for example. So when I'm as a site builder adding a field to a node type or a term or whatever, to an entity, there should be a huge like linking banner, make this a very important, make this a good description.
Actually, Jennifer Hopkin is redoing the help system, and I think they're putting something in there that is not only per module, but also more per task. So that might be a useful thing to actually put into there. As a, not only how do you put a field on a page, but how do you actually label and describe that thing well, and stuff like when you choose a drop-down menu or auto-complete field. So if you could put those practices together, I think lots of people would benefit from that.
So 2 things. First is I think it's a really good idea to make this part of the code standards, like to have just a section on how to write proper UI text and keep it short, just stuff like that. So we have some general guidance. I think Drupal is so pluriform that it's really hard to set very strict standards, but still. And the other thing is, I have a lot of clients who are actually involved in wanting to change certain interface text. And these issues always arise during translation of the interface. So if you, there's like 1 million submit, the word submit within the user interface text, it's so prevalent throughout the code that it's really hard to find out the context of the exact submit text that you want to change. So, and the interface for translation doesn't really support context-specific translation either. But I have a client, and they say we want to change this word submit on this exact page into send, something simple, just because it makes more sense in their use case. And they can't find it, so they have to scroll through 15 pages of search results within user interface translation until they find the exact submit, or they change a couple of other ones until they find it. And I think it would be really useful just to have like an example link through to the place where this exact user interface text appears, and to have some context what you're actually translating, and then have this fed back into the improving the technical texts themselves. Mm-hmm. Because actually my clients are already pretty involved, but their involvement breaks on the translation process usually. I don't know if this is something you recognize.
Yeah.
I think for Drupal 7 there certainly was a module where you would have a kind of bar at the bottom to translate with only the words that are on the page kind of show up as options.
It's a global translation.
The LTN client, yeah, but it didn't really pay attention to context.
Yeah.
So sometimes you would translate something and it would translate everywhere.
There is context support for translation function, but almost nobody uses it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think actually to look at, I mean, even if you have you can actually change the interface text if you translate it from English to English. There's an option to do that, which works fine if you have multilingual sites and you have the /en anyway. But it would also be interesting to see what kind of texts there are that people regularly change that way, because if we can see there are certain words, certain bits of text that are regularly changed, doing that for your client side, then we might actually have an idea where the pain points are of text that we should actually change in core instead of letting every site builder do this.
So we should think about retrieving those statistics from a wide group of users, right?
Yeah, for example. Mm-hmm. Or from a group of site builders says these are the things I always change, or these are the things I really would like to change. I always have to tell my client that this is hard work.
So that means at least that translators is one more target audience that should be on your list, right?
Yes, that's a good point. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've looked at the Drupal default pages, which of course don't have any languages. So, but yes, translators also encounter, and they of course encounter the thing that they quite often don't know whether text is user-generated, configuration, or UI text, and where they then need to try and find this translation, because that lives in different places. Or if they then want to actually change something and make a patch, you also then need to find out which module is actually coming from. And if I make a patch and put it there, will actually somebody see it and deal with it? That's another issue that for me comes on the how do we get there? Is once somebody actually makes a patch or proposes a text, how do we make sure that people actually are willing to deal with that?
Make a new tag for the issue.
There is a tag called UI text, but that kind of falls under usability, and usability has already lots of work on its plate. So there aren't many people that are actually interested in changing these texts. So we have a tag, but I feel very alone on the wide area of Drupal with trying to do something about them.
Let's do a presentation. The tag.
Ah yes,
Hashtag.
good point. I'll do that. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
It helps us in improving Drupal core.
You mean you get me drunk and
I don't mean wine. Your involvement here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We now have 5 minutes for a short refill. while Niels will set up his presentation, because we still have about half an hour, a little bit more, until the pizzas come. So then we do the second talk, and then after the second talk we have the pizzas. Yes. Cool. Yeah. Je hebt jezelf aangesloten? Ben jij dit? Ik ben niet, ja. Wat voor aansluiting is die? Kan die erin? Dan zou het werken. Je bent pizza.
Kan het ietsje korter doen? Ja, wat we wel kunnen doen is dat kun je precies antwoorden. Het is altijd een beetje gedaan, precies om 7 uur komen. Dat is ook wel een het theoretische deel en als er dan iets is, dat er dan de echte fun.
Als dat zo uitkomt.
Oké, dan houden we het aan. Ja.
I'm hoping to.
Is daar ook daar wil je zijn.
Ja.
Nou, er zijn een aantal pagina's met allerlei die heeft ons spijt. Waarom ook zeg maar muziek
Hij was echt van, is er zo'n staat bleek toch eigenlijk beter? Ja, inderdaad. Je had een rente. Heel veel mensen wel nog een ja, nee, want het is gewoon, je weet niet zo de tekst.
Maybe suppose an extra issue type.
Okay, ik heb afgelopen week veel
Yeah, already code reputation.
Mensen die een week van tevoren weggekomen van moet wat gebeuren.
Ja,
en dan zeg je nou dat voor wat werk je.
Reputation.
Hij kan beter.
It's like the door handles where you have to write on push or push to figure out what's good. That's like Somewhere also when you use console to create a module. Has lots of good before.
En dan heb je gewoon wat variabelen die je aan kunt passen. Dat is gewoon een beetje handmatige stijling.
Ja, iets easy bij dat.
Een module description.
En hij gaat er vanuit.
Dus dat is een beetje
But you can follow those standard. That's something like kind of standard.
En dan de 17. Je hebt de standaard cookies disabled. Ja. Wat zei je nou dat Fanta al lang?
Just change it to iOS and JavaScript.
Change it to that's something awesome.
Full stop. Hoort straks toch zijn dat iedereen op straat. Ja? Iedereen voelt het een beetje aan kan waar.
Hartslag op een moment.
Nou,
Dat weet ik niet.
Dat benzinehoefspan.
Zullen we beginnen dan? Iedereen wil zo zijn? Ja, nee.
Muziek niet. Ik ben niet zo van, dus ik kan ook meekrijgen.
Dan ga ik zo het woord geven aan Niels. Ik heb toevallig het ook al eerder gezien. Hoe verder je vooraan zit, hoe meer je ziet hoor. Het gaat heel leuk worden.
Ik niet.
Dus valt verder weinig aan toe te voegen geloof ik.
Niels die was spreker op Front-End United, voor degenen die dat niet weten. En ik ken Mark, zaten in de organisatie van Front-End United. En als organisator krijg je eigenlijk niks van die talks mee. Dus we hebben echt heel veel rondgerend en van alles gedaan en gezien, maar geen talks. Dus ik ben heel blij dat Niels alsnog die talk hier kon geven. Dat kan ik gewoon eens rustig.
So I'm going to do this in English as well. So this is my heartbeat live right now in the browser. It's a little bit higher than usual. That's not because I'm nervous, but I brought hardware demos with me, so I'm actually terrified. I did this talk once before in London, and pretty much none of the demos worked. Except for the heartbeat one. So this is a little bit higher, but it's not as high as in London. That's, yeah. So just to prove that this is my live heartbeat, I'm going to take it off. It's just a little Bluetooth heart rate monitor, and there is a little bit of delay, but now. Come on.
Just the fact that it doesn't change anymore.
It doesn't change. So that teaches me one lesson: don't mess with your demos on the day before you do a talk. I may have some problems later on. Okay, let's get on with it. Yes. So this talk is fun with Bluetooth. And one of the first questions I always get when I do this talk is, why? We're talking about browsers here. Why would you want to do this talk with Bluetooth? Now, the answer to that question is actually progressive web apps, and they are awesome. They're great. You get offline support. You get an add to home screen, and you can basically do everything a normal app can do. Well, except for one thing. They are bound to what the browser can do, and browsers are great for talking to servers, but not for local devices you have at home. To do that, you need native apps. But I don't want to download a 500 megabyte app on my phone. It's a crappy app, it doesn't work anymore, it was built somewhere in China, and they don't know much about building good apps. Or I want to use my laptop and not my phone, and they only build a phone app. So what do you do? It's not just for using it constantly, it's also for setting up things. Like if you have a Logitech Harmony remote, for example, If you want to control multiple devices, you have to set it up. To do that, you have to install an app. And then go through all the setup, and what would be easier, well, just connect it to your computer, or using Bluetooth, not even connected to a computer, but just clicking on a button on the website and start the setup. You don't have to download 500 megabytes and install drivers and stuff like that. So, why are PWAs or web apps not suitable for talking to devices? Well, I have this Sonos device and it has Wi-Fi. I have these fancy lights and they have Wi-Fi. And I have Philips Hue lamps and they use Zigbee, but there is a bridge that uses Wi-Fi or Ethernet. And so all of these devices run web servers. So you could just connect to it. Just an API you could use, fetch XML HTTP request. So let's try that. There's first a problem. We need to connect to an internal IP address, and we don't know which one. So to find out, Philips, for example, has a nice API. You can call this URL. You get back some JSON with the IP address of the device, the bridge on your local internet, local network. You have the IP address, and then you can connect to it. So you can request some XML, which contains the version number, or you can skip this. And then you have an API. To use that API, you first have to authenticate, because security is important. So you have to physically press a button on the device to actually be able to connect to it. Then you get a token back and you can use that token for further calls. Why is this important? Because if this weren't there, anybody on your local network could change the lights. The lights isn't that bad, but if you have a Sonos, which actually doesn't have this, anybody on your local network, like say for example me, on the network of my neighbors, could walk up to their house, connect to their Wi-Fi, and start really annoying music in the middle of the night. Well, Philips thought about this and they did something better. So once we have the token, we can now query the state of the lights. We have the brightness, the hue, and so on. And we can set the state of the lights. And this works. I've tried it, it works. So I built an app. And I built a progressive web app, and then I connected to the lights. And I clicked, and I clicked, and I connected, and I reloaded, and I clicked again, and it didn't work. Why? Because the bridge uses HTTP, and progressive web apps use HTTPS only, so they can't talk to each other. Yeah, and even if the bridge would have talked HTTPS, it wouldn't get a certificate anyway, because it just has an internal IP address, and internal IP addresses can't get certificates. And even if you would assign a domain name, you couldn't get a certificate because it has to be verified by the certificate authority. And it's on a local network, and you can't do that. So this doesn't work. Network is great for remote APIs, but not for local devices. At least not from web apps. If you're a native app, well, you don't care about security. You can do anything. So there's a workaround for this. You can actually connect to a machine somewhere on the internet, a server, and send the commands there, and it will relay them to the bridge in your local network. The bridge in your local network has a socket connection to that server, so everything gets relayed. That works. This is what Philips has to say about this API. We are currently preparing for a release of this remote API, which initially be available to a limited number of partners. That basically means that was 2 years ago. It's still very limited. It's just Nest, Google Assistant, and IFTTT. And even if it were available to us developers, would we want to use this? Because we have no idea what happens when you need to turn on the light. This is their infrastructure. To turn on a light, we have a dozen different servers located who knows where. So to turn on a light, you press a button, the signal goes to the US, China, whatever, and then comes back to your home, and then hopefully a light turns on. This isn't really, well, this is far removed from just flicking a switch in your home. And I don't think we want to do this. So far this has been PWA problems with local networks. I promised fun with Bluetooth. So here goes. Bluetooth. So when I talk about Bluetooth, everybody just says Bluetooth sucks. Bluetooth sucks. It's slow, it's limited range pairing, it's 20-year-old technology, 20-year-old standards. Why would you want to use Bluetooth? Well, that's true. It's all true. But then you're thinking about classic Bluetooth and not Bluetooth Low Energy. Bluetooth Low Energy is actually really cool. It's a modern standard, and it solves all of those problems you had before. So it has a problem because it's not well known, because there are many names to refer to it, like BLE, Bluetooth Low Energy, Bluetooth Smart, Bluetooth 4, Bluetooth 5. Now, if you're worried about range, that was one of the big problems of Bluetooth 4, or Bluetooth Classic. They managed to get this working between two devices with a range of a kilometer. So this is pretty powerful technology. And 10 million devices ship every single day with Bluetooth, like phones, computers, other types of devices like glucose monitors, with serious medical applications, activity trackers, and IoT devices like light bulbs, and not just serious applications, but cute little robots, fun gadgets, drones, for example, fidget spinners. Forget about that. So, before the fun part, the boring theoretical stuff. Yeah, we have two types of Bluetooth devices. We have central devices and peripherals. Central devices are devices that can connect to another device. A peripheral is a device that can be connected to. We can connect from a central device to multiple different peripherals at the same time, but they can't talk to each other. The drone can't talk to the light bulb if it wanted to. I don't know why, but it can't. But the central device could relay messages between the two, but you have to program that yourself. So, and we're not talking about Bluetooth Low Energy in general, but a specific profile of Bluetooth Low Energy, and it's called Generic Attribute Profile. And it has a very obvious abbreviation. No, GATT. And you can forget about that. Just GATT, remember, that's just 4 letters. And it's in the API I'm going to talk to in a minute. But what it actually does, you can forget about it. When we're talking about GATT, we no longer have central devices and peripherals, we have clients and servers. So your light bulb is a server. Yeah. I had to wrap my head around that one for a bit because it seems illogical. But actually the light bulb offers a service. Light. So it's a server. And your device, your mobile phone or computer or your browser, that is the client. The browser is always a client because it talks to servers. But actually, it makes sense. So a light bulb, for example, has different services, like device information, that's a standard, like the manufacturer name, model, and so on, and light. And believe it or not, light is not a standard. So if you have multiple light bulbs, they can all talk in a different way. I'm going to talk about that later. Drones have battery standard. We have flight control, which isn't the standard. This cute robot also has device information, battery, and steering control, which also isn't standard. And if you have a heart rate monitor, you have device information, battery, and heart rate, which is a standard. Except if you buy this one, this is a very cheap one, it doesn't have device information or battery, and the heart rate isn't a standard. It uses something completely different. Because why would you follow standards? The little bit more expensive one I have, that actually follows the standards. So. A service has multiple characteristics, like manufacturer, model number, serial number, and so on. Those are characteristics. You can think of it like this. We have a server, which is kind of like an array of objects. And a service is an object in that array, a characteristic which is property of that object, and they have values. It's just different words, but it kind of overlaps. But it is really, it's not a web standard, Bluetooth. So there are a lot of quirks, and we're going to find out that it may look like an object. We have to use a really weird API to get to that value. So services and characteristics are identified by UUIDs, which are 16-bit or 128 bits. And they look like this. Device information is standard, it's 180A. And the 128-bit version of that is the same. Battery is 180F. And if we want to use a non-standard version, we are not allowed to use the 16-bit version, but we have to use the 128-bit version and stay out of this range. Because this range is reserved for standards. But still, everybody uses the 16-bit version because standards. So our device information characteristics don't look like this. If we look at the device, they look like this. So we have to know what each of these little numbers mean. And if it's a standard, it's documented. And we can just find out. If it's not standard device, then we're going to run into some issues. Each characteristic, the value can be written to, or you can get notifications, which is kind of like add event listener. And each value is an array of bytes. There are no fancy data types, it's just bytes. So, phew. That was the boring theoretical part. So how does this look like? I brought this light bulb with me, and if I use my phone to connect to it, I can see all kinds of different services, like device information, or battery service. I can tell the battery level 90%. But I'm more interested in one of the custom services, like this one. There are a whole bunch of characteristics there. And I have no clue what they do. But there's one very interesting one. It's the top one. There are 4 bytes there. what if I change the bytes? Say, for example, 00FF0000. The light bulb turns red. Okay. What if I change it to 0000FF00? Turns green. There's a pattern emerging. Let's try 000000FF. What's going to be?
Oh, blue.
Yeah. So, what does that first byte do?
Opacity. Right.
Let's try it. FF000000.
It's probably off.
It's white. Because there are 4 LEDs in this light bulb. And each of these bytes control the intensity of one of those 4 LEDs. So we can ignore that first byte and create basically every color we want. And we all know this method of writing colors because it's just HTML or CSS. Same thing. So, we're done with boring facts about Bluetooth. Now finally the fun part. Finally. But first. I haven't talked about the API yet. But let's do that first. So, we can connect to a device. There's an API for that. Navigator.bluetooth.requestDevice. And we can specify some filters like a name prefix, or we can specify a service as filter to make sure a particular device actually has a service before we connect to it. And we have to specify all the services we're actually going to use, optional services, property. Once we execute this command, a dialog pops up. And the user has to click and select a device. This is intentional. A web page can't just connect to devices at will. This is security. You have to manually select the device you want to connect to. And then you get a promise back. And using that promise, you can connect to the GATT server. Now we can forget about GATT. And we get a promise back. And we can get the primary service. And we get a promise back. And we get the characteristic, and we get a promise back. With that promise, we can start writing data. For example, we can call write value on that characteristic promise with an array of bytes. We can leave the first byte just off, and we can specify RGB values, and then the light of the light bulb changes. We can get current value by reading the data. We call read value on the characteristic, and we get the value back as a promise. And we can get notified of changes, which is particularly useful if you want to connect, for example, to a heart rate monitor and it changes constantly, and we want to know when it changes. I kind of mentioned it was kind of like add event listener. That is because it is add event listener on the characteristic with characteristic value changed, and we get the value back as a callback. But we must not forget to actually start notifications because the bandwidth on Bluetooth is limited, and we don't want to send messages over the network without a reason. And that's it. That's basically 90% of the WebBluetooth API. So, what else do you need to know? Promises and typed arrays. And those are basically standards. They are part of the JavaScript standard nowadays. MCScript standard, sorry. So, browser support. Now, this is the sad part, because it's basically just Chromium-based browsers. It's like Chrome, Opera, and Samsung Internet on mobile phones. And Servo, which is an experimental browser platform made by Mozilla, also has support. And features that will turn up in Servo tend to end up also in Firefox. So there's hope it will also move to Firefox. And there is iOS support. No, I'm kidding. Well, there is iOS support, but it's not Safari. There is an app for iOS. It's called WebBluetooth, and it's well, it's kind of like a demo browser. It's used great for demos. I wouldn't use it for my daily browsing, but it still works. It's really cool. And they're supporting Electron. Node.js has can install Node Web Bluetooth for it. They're supporting Cordova, and there's also supporting devices like this. This is a really small Bluetooth beacon that actually runs JavaScript.
What?
And yeah, this runs JavaScript. And has a battery that lasts about a year. And you can use it as a central device, and you can use it as a peripheral. So basically, I can click on it, and I can turn on lightbulb. I'm not going to do that because I forgot to install the demo on the button. But I could if I wanted to. So, what are some of the things I encountered during all of this? Well, not following standards. So I mentioned this light bulb, and we've gone over this. This is pretty simple. It's not a standard, but this is probably the best you're gonna encounter. I also have some other light bulbs, like this one. It's a little bit weird. The way to write RGB is really unconventional. And there's bytes with 0 zeros in there and 0 ones. And
But why?
why? Yeah. Well, I can explain why. Because there are also versions of this light bulb with more than 3 LEDs. So this value, for example, is for warm white, and this is for cold white. And if I change this 01 to 00, it just turns off the green completely. Basically the same thing as you provide a value of 0 for green. But I don't know why they did that. This one is a little bit more complicated because every byte has to be exactly the same thing as here, as I've written down here. If you change 1 byte, it doesn't work. Of course, the RGB values, those are variables. And every single message that you send using this has to have a random number in there, because no 2 messages can be consecutive. Or no consecutive messages can be exactly the same. So, random number. And there has to be a CRC value in there, because, or a checksum, because. Reasons. Now, I also have one of those with me. This is a LED matrix. So basically, it's the same thing as a light bulb, except there are 64 LEDs. And the only thing we have to specify, other than the RGB value, is which of the LEDs we're going to change. So you can change them one at a time. And there's 2 bytes as 0702. But that's just magic numbers that have to be there. But so this kind of makes sense. Ish, yeah. This one, this is kind of the same. Again, 2 bytes, position, RGB. And then you have to do some extra stuff. We can go over this if you want, but this is really weird. If you have a question about that, I'll happily answer it. Let's just move on. So how do you find out this stuff? Well, it isn't standards.
Documentation, obviously.
Documentation, obviously. No, wrong.
Trial and error.
Well, not completely wrong. For some of these devices I brought with me, there is documentation. It's not a standard, but they were graciously enough to provide documentation, but not for all. So what you can do is use Bluetooth network sniffer. So I have this USB key, it's just 20 euros or something like that. I can plug it into my computer. Well, if it had a USB-A port, that is. So I can plug it into my dongle, unplug that one into my computer. And it basically, you can intercept messages. But that's kind of sounds scary, security-wise.
Legal.
Hmm?
Is it legal?
Yeah, this is absolutely legal if you do it to your own devices. And you can use Wireshark and then see the packets and find out that way. But even for this one, that I didn't know. So there is one other way, and you can actually decompile APKs. So if you download the Android APK file from some website and then pass it through some decompiler, you get the source code. The source code that the guys that made this wrote. You can use that for, well, inspiration. That works really well. So, well, the pizzas aren't here yet, so I guess I'm going to do demos. Finally, the fun part. Well, maybe for you, for me, not so much, because I'm actually literally terrified. Because this is experimental technology. This may not work. In fact, probably one or two of the demos will not work. I mentioned London. None of the demos work. And that was because of a bug in Chrome, not because of my demos. They are perfect. So there's Wi-Fi interference. Well, if you are at home, there are no problems at all. But as soon as you get some more people in a room with Wi-Fi devices, they use the same frequency. So that doesn't help. No.
Everyone turn off your Wi-Fi, please.
I'm not going to ask. I'm going to ask you to tweet something later. Please use this hashtag. I'll explain later. So, the demos. I'm just gonna switch. So I'm just gonna take a moment and I took off the heart rate monitor. Otherwise, it would be a little bit higher than it was before I started this talk. So, I brought a light bulb with me. I'm going to turn it on. Turn it off. There it is. It's touch sensitive, so every time I touch it, it changes color. So I built this demo, and if everything works, I can connect to it. There it is. It's connected. Okay, one thing, there's a color, it's black, and this is white. That's because it's light. And it doesn't work for this color, but I can change it basically to every other color I want. For example, I can change it. Doesn't work. Let's try that again. Okay, now my heart rate really is higher than starting to approach London levels. It works. I can basically change it to any color I want. Well, let's just.
What happens on black?
Why is black?
It's off.
Well, why did it change to white and you put it down?
Well, I can. That's the way it works. So what else can we do with this? Let's try. I have some CSS here. I can turn it red. I can turn it orange.
Silver.
Silver. Yeah. Well, the colors are a bit off. That's because this light bulb is a little bit funky. The 3 LEDs in there aren't recalibrated, so it makes a little bit of a mess of the colors. What else could I do? CSS animations. CSS animations on a light bulb.
Cool.
So this is a little bit cheating, because the animation isn't actually running on the light bulb. It's running on the light bulb on the screen, and I just pull every few milliseconds the current color and send that over to the light bulb. But it's still pretty cool. Let's try something else. I brought this little Lego car with me.
You can lower the table.
No, this is fine. As long as I don't drive off the table. Like I did in Utrecht. I put it on the ground. So, this usually comes with an IR receiver, but they have, or not Lego, but there is a Bluetooth receiver for sale from a third party, and it actually works pretty well, as long as I don't go forward or backwards. I put it on the ground.
What's the range?
10 meters, 15 meters, something like that. Yeah. This is getting boring pretty fast. It's cool. CSS animations? I have one. I use keyframes and I use CSS variables to specify direction, left, right, forwards, backwards. And I just have to remove this dash. And then, after 2 seconds late, well, I don't think you thought you were going to see car driven by CSS animations this morning.
But in this case, the animation runs on the car.
No. It's still just in the browser.
Yeah, I think you just measure the color of the button.
No. What I do is I use CSS variables, so I can get the computed style of this car, and it contains the value of the current CSS variable, the current, let's see.
Current direction.
Yeah, current direction. Yeah.
Nice.
So I also brought this one with me. But this is pretty much the same thing, except it's ball. I'm not going to do that on the table. So it's basically the same thing. Okay. I could demo CSS animations. Well, we've done that. What if I could draw a path and follow along the path? Let's see. First I have to calibrate, and this is fine. Then I could draw a map. For example, go there and go back. I could use a little bit more complicated. All right.
Almost.
Yeah, it takes some finessing. I just built this a day or two ago, so it hasn't been properly calibrated yet. But so what I'm doing here is basically using canvas and mouse events to draw that path, and from the coordinates I get from the mouse events, I create vectors. Basically just a length and an angle, and I send that to the little robot. And that's basically all. So I created this demo in, I think, maybe an hour or 3. Wow. And then I took another 2 days to actually do the graphics. So
what happens? How does it release the Bluetooth pairing? If you close the tab, it releases.
Yeah.
And it's
well connected. Nobody else can connect. So I brought this Lego head with me. Inside of this Lego head is a little gadget, gyroscope, and I just connected to it. So that means if I pick up this Lego head, I can just do this. Nice. So basically everything I do is mirrored on screen. I could use that for steering, for example, like braking, or accelerating, or right, left. I could do that. So now I'm connected to 2 devices at once. So I could This is more difficult than it looks. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect this one. And if you have an Android phone, modernly recent Android phone, you could connect to this device. You have to use Chrome and then go to bluetooth.rocks/racer. If you do that, the first one that connects to it can control it. bluetooth.rocks/racer. And all the while, I'm going to quickly demo this one. So this pixel matrix, I'm just going to do a quick demo.
I'll disconnect so somebody else can connect.
One of my hobbies is procrastinating. So I like to draw cute little monsters, just for fun. Right. This one. So this one is 11 by 11 pixels, and you can basically draw anything you want. You could use it to send notifications. Oh, my server is down. Little red monster. Or, unit testing succeeded. The green monster. Stuff like that. Then I have one demo left. It is a little printer. So I'm going to print some tweets. So if you print some, or if you tweet something with the Drupal Tech Talk hashtag, hopefully, if my server is still up, it will be printed.
Well, let's try that. Just tweet it something.
So I basically promise one of the demos is going to fail. So this is all. Try again. Quickly peek. Oh no, there isn't a WebSocket connection. Well, then I'm going to move on. So I mentioned drones, right? I said this was the last demo, but I do have one more tab here. And it's for controlling a drone.
And there's a box you didn't open.
And I have this box here. Now the thing is, when I first tried this, I killed some plants. My wife wasn't happy about that. This little Lego guy almost got decapitated. And he wasn't happy about that. So I have no idea if it's going to work. And the ceiling is pretty low, so just might just crash horribly.
You only live once.
Yeah, you only live once. Now, while I connect to this, please don't go to bluetooth.rocks/drone and try it yourself, because then we're really going to have accidents. So, it's connected. You'll notice there is a big red button. That is there for a reason. If I press that button, and I will press it if I accidentally fly over you guys, it will stop the motors and it will crash on top of you. But at least the motors aren't spinning.
That's a good.
That's a good thing.
Are you using the Lego head?
I'm not going to use the Lego head. No. So let's try this. A little bit forward, please. There. Somehow, I don't have much control at the moment. So on the front row, please watch out. It goes all over the place. I'm not sure why.
Just some wind.
Oh, this is really scary. Okay. Quickly. Okay, that almost went completely wrong. Well, I did buy a second one last week because I actually crashed it last week into a tree. So one of the propellers is bent, and maybe that is the reason why I don't have that much flight control.
There's also an aircode just.
That also doesn't help. Right. So that were the demos. Pizza's here, so I'm just gonna quickly say this has been lots of fun, but there are also serious applications for this. For example, well, a set of devices and IoT and medical applications like e-health, like sending doctors information about your glucose levels or heart rate to them without using an app in a safe and secure way. But it is also a lot of fun. Thank you.
Cool.
Dankjewel.
Graag gedaan.
Dankjewel. I would propose, if there are any questions, let's do it over pizza. And
That'll be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey.